I think it's time to start. So let me welcome you here today by just giving you a recap of the first three lectures. In the first lecture, we talked about the Portuguese seaborne empire, why Portugal took to the sea in the first place, and how it ended up kind of owning the biggest chunk of South America. And we talked about the sugar economy, which was the predominant form of economy for the first 150 years. In the second lecture, we explained how things changed in the 18th century for both Portugal and Brazil. And this was at least partly the fault of the English, who in the Methuen Treaty subordinated the Portuguese to the English economy by a very aggressive negotiation about tariffs, a situation, of course, which seems very contemporary. And we also talked about the rise of the Marquês de Pombal, who was the great dictator, the enlightened dictator in the 18th century in Portugal. And in the third lecture yesterday, we told how the struggle to abolish slavery also, in the end, finished off the monarchy. So we ended yesterday's lecture with the military coup, whereby a group of officers under the leadership of professional soldiers imbued with a positivist philosophy decided to send the House of Braganza back to Europe and established a republic in Brazil for the first time. But that republic was terribly unstable and of course was dominated by the military for some years. And I finished by discussing the extraordinary epic of the resistance offered in the northeast in the town of Canudos, which is the subject of the great Brazilian national epic, Os Sertões, which is translated in English as Rebellion in the Backlands. And that was how I finished the lecture yesterday. Now, in today's lecture, we are mainly concerned with the struggle against underdevelopment. Because, of course, you've got to realize that Brazil, right the way through till the end of the 19th century, was very much an underdeveloped economy, with a large proportion of the population living in abject poverty, their bodies not rising to full height. Stunting was quite a normal feature of the population, and dying prematurely or dying in infancy. So very much an underdeveloped country, and today it is a semi-developed country. And so there was this tremendous struggle against underdevelopment, and a particularly arduous one given the weaknesses of the Brazilian state. It's not a case that we have a Marquês de Pombal anymore. And so there is this serious set of challenges imposed by the weaknesses of the state, and there's constant worry about interference from the military. So that's the main burden of today's story. I'm going to mainly be talking about the 1930s, but I also need to set this in the context of a more general kind of economic development. So here's a kind of capsule economic history. So long as it was dominated by the staple and mineral economy, Brazil faced an uncertain, dependent fate. Resources such as arable land and payable mineral deposits would in the long run be depleted. I mentioned in earlier lectures already how sugar tends to exhaust the soil, and so the sugar plantations historically tended to move. And that was just one of the ways in which the earlier economy dependent on resources such as arable and minerals ran into trouble. But more fundamental issue is the fact that the value of these items as exports depended very much on the demand in more advanced industrial societies. So this is a general point that you can have societies around the world which are living in so-called natural economies, where they just about feed themselves and they just about manage to survive, or at any rate they survive well enough in order to have children and push the population along in the next generation, but life is not great. To develop, you actually need to go beyond that. And this has depended historically on either developing one's own economy, pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, or more frequently by exporting to other countries, and that was certainly the case for Brazil. But the moment you were dependent on exports, the price of exports depended on the other party. And the other party, of course, very often had a choice of where it was going to import the staples from. Here's an example. The first Industrial Revolution was all about textiles, and it induced a worldwide scramble to produce cotton, which was essentially won until the American Civil War by the American South. But when the cotton supplies were interrupted as a result of the American Civil War, the British and various other textile manufacturers desperately cast around all over the world to look for cotton manufacturers, for cotton growers, and so cotton growing opened up in all sorts of strange places, notably Egypt. And there were also attempts made in West Africa and in South America. So that's an example of how this structure of production works in the early days of industrialization. Now, cotton growing was not important in 19th century Brazil. In the first 150 years, it was entirely sugar and tobacco, mainly sugar. And then in the 18th century, as I was explaining on Tuesday, we got the opening of a pastoral economy. Cows and various kind of things associated with the pastoral economy, production of cheese and butter and similar sorts of things, and milk, of course. That was part of the story. But the other great thing in the 18th century was minerals. One of the world's earliest gold rushes was the gold rush to dig for precious metals in Minas Gerais. So, in the 19th century, there were two further rounds of staple cycles. The coffee boom, which was at its height from 1830 to 1850, and the rubber boom from 1879 to 1912. In 1866, looking at Brazil from the point of view of the first industrial revolution, Brazil had a grand total of 9 textile factories altogether. So it was really shut out of the industrial world. And it seemed that Brazil would never make it into the big league. And this worried various progressive people in Rio, and there were all sorts of discussions at the Athenaeum and the other Rio clubs about what Brazilians could do to escape from underdevelopment. And of course, in the late 19th century, we had a second industrial revolution taking place, associated particularly with electricity, and it was particularly challenging for the Brazilians that the Second Industrial Revolution was led by strong states such as Imperial Germany. So that was the situation faced by Brazilians at the end of the 19th century. Say a little bit more about the coffee and milk economy. It's always referred to in this way, café com leche. The economy which was characteristic of the early First Republic. It dominated in the south, in the states of Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. They were the two big areas with regard to both population and with regard to coffee production. We saw in the lecture on Tuesday how the mines relied heavily on slave labor. The same was true of coffee. Coffee plants needed much labor, and before abolition, the labor was mainly provided by slaves. So I've got this rather nice Victorian photograph here on the right, showing you a coffee plantation with its workers who are overwhelmingly slaves. So it's the continuation of the big house and the slave quarters, and it's the subject of Gilberto Freire's second book in his trilogy, The Mansions and the Shanties. He's concerned with the coffee and milk period in Brazil's history, but puts the focus for the first time on urban groups, and with unemployment rampant in the countryside, people flocked into the cities, and you get the first shanty towns emerging, and that's really the new thing on which he focuses in the title of his book. But there was also rubber production, and from a humanitarian point of view, rubber production was even worse. For rubber production, Indians were also enslaved. And again, I've got this rather horrendous photograph of a group of 4 Indians who've been working in a rubber plantation wearing their chains. And this is a horror story several times over, because extraordinarily the case of the African slaves who worked on the mines and on the sugar plantations, there was more concern among the masters about these people than there was about the Indians. And when slavery was abolished, it was well and truly abolished with regard to blacks from Africa, but the people with the copper-colored skins, who were the indigenous tribes, it lingered. Somehow these people were regarded as so beneath the notice of humanity that no efforts were made to ensure that slavery was abolished on the rubber plantations. Of course, the rubber plantations, some of them were very remotely located along the Amazon, but it's a sort of characteristic feature of Brazilian history as a whole. Freire has an amusing chapter about it called, what's it called? Showing the English. When the English were the predominant force culturally and politically and economically in the 19th century, and were Portugal's oldest ally, pressure was put on the Brazilians by various English representatives to kind of secure various kinds of humanitarian objectives, and the tendency of the Brazilians was always to say yes or mañana, and ignore the instructions completely. So there's this tendency of having a law on the books which is not enforced. And this has been a recurrent problem in Brazilian history right to this day. Now, at the other end, of course, rubber became, that is the industrial world, rubber became very important once we got the development of the motor industry, particularly, of course, after we got the development of standardized production, the famous Henry Ford conveyor belts with motor cars being assembled as a mass process. And the Americans were very concerned about the situation of the rubber producers in Brazil. Unlike coffee, rubber was, of course, a product which had been part of the Brazilian vegetation right the way back. Coffee was actually imported in the 18th century via the French. Coffee probably originated in Ethiopia. That's the belief of the great Russian botanist Vavilov, who made an intense study of domestication of plants already in the 1930s. He thought that almost certainly coffee originated in Ethiopia. But it had spread beyond Ethiopia already in medieval times, and of course was a big sensation when it was first imported into Europe in the 17th century, and the French were great consumers, and it was from a French coffee production that an enterprising Brazilian thief managed to lift the first coffee plants which went to Brazil. But rubber had been there in the Amazon from time immemorial. The big trouble with rubber initially was that it was such a kind of soft and gooey substance. Learning how to make rubber vulcanized and therefore stronger was itself a kind of technological challenge in the 19th century. But eventually they surmounted it, and eventually, of course, they wanted rubber for the tires of motor cars. So Henry Ford, who was nothing if not entrepreneurial, but also, of course, was very keen on his own social agenda, he thought the answer was to create an American-style kind of mass production center in the Amazon. So in the 1920s, Henry Ford attempted to create a free labor rubber utopia, a plantation called Fordlandia in the 1920s. I've got a picture of it down below where you can see what the labor force looks like. And unfortunately it was not a success. The jungle kind of kept invading, and the plants wouldn't do the things the Americans wanted them to do, and there were also various hostile animals, and there were transport problems, and etc., etc., etc. The place was recently rediscovered by an American historian who was working from the Ford archives, and thought it would be interesting to go and see if he could find it in the Amazon, and he did, and has written an interesting book about it. But this again is an example of recipes for development coming in from outside and not necessarily making much sense. Now, need to say a little bit more about the politics in relation to the economics of the First Republic until the 1920s. Now, economically, the years before and after World War I were troubled for various reasons, one of which was adherence to the gold standard, which had been a major fetish of particularly British policy during the course of the 19th century. Actually, the truth of the matter is that adherence to the gold standard was not always 100%. In fact, silver held out for a long time, and there were people who were betting that the world's gold supply would be insufficient to maintain the gold standard, and people were putting a lot of money into silver mines, particularly in Nevada and similar places, when the Witwatersrand came on stream, and the rest, as they say, is history. So the gold standard depended on having a steady supply of gold, steady and increasing supply of gold, to match the steady and increasing volume of world commerce. But this wasn't always possible, and so the gold standard was periodically attended by crises, and of course countries which were trying to operate on the gold standard and were facing substantial changes in their pattern of imports and exports were constantly running into balance of payments problems. So this system was particularly burdensome in the case of Brazil, where you had these major staples in the exports, and the price of coffee or the price of precious stones could alter dramatically, and that would require some sort of bridging, and Brazil regularly got into trouble with the balance of payments, or with borrowing, or with printing money, or it was a long series of melodramas, minor melodramas for the most part, but it was one of the problems faced by the Brazilian economy in the 19th century up till the First World War. So that was one set of problems. The other set of problems were related to the fact that there was world coffee overproduction. The golden age of coffee production in Brazil had coincided with major coffee calamities in the Far East. I think there had been production in Sri Lanka, which was then, of course, called Ceylon, and that was a part of the reason why the Brazilian coffee economy boomed as strongly as it did in the mid-19th century. There was a period when they were providing something like 60% of the world's output. But of course, that didn't last, and so as we get towards the end of the century, there are serious problems about coffee overproduction, first of all on a world scale, and then subsequently in Brazil itself. Now, the powerful states of Minas and Sao Paulo, between them dominated the Brazilian Congress, just in terms of size of population and number of votes. So if they could get their act together, they could, in theory at any rate, make sure that the Brazilian state propped up the coffee growers. And this is what eventually happened, but it took some years before the appropriate negotiations had been made. Federalism and the general state of weak political parties made concerted public action to deal with the problems of the currency and the problems of coffee production difficult. But eventually, the agricultural forces in Sao Paulo and Minas, the two biggest states, came together to launch the ambitious coffee valorization support scheme, which required the state to purchase and store the excess production of coffee each year, and then to release it at appropriate times onto the market at future stages. And this kind of stabilization scheme was something which had a substantial future. There was a whole lot of other attempts at stabilization schemes in the 20th century in other parts of the world, and and it attracted the attention of a number of civil servants. There's the Grondona Plan, and it attracted a number of theorists. There's a wonderful book on the subject by Joseph Stiglitz, together with David Newbury, who's an economist who I knew slightly, about how to run a rational support plan. It's actually quite difficult. So the coffee valorization scheme was a major effort, and it lasts right the way through till the 1930s. It was terribly politically controversial. My favorite Brazilian economist, Celso Furtado, argues that it was actually serving a useful purpose. It served the purpose of maintaining aggregate demand during the challenging time of the world slumps attendant on the end of the First World War and, of course, the great crash of 1929. So Brazil, to some extent, and for kind of reasons which were more due to good luck than good management, managed to survive and do reasonably well at a time when other countries were really suffering because of the coffee valorization scheme. At least that's Celso Furtado's argument. But, of course, it was widely hated in Brazil itself, especially, of course, in the non-coffee growing regions. And even in the coffee growing regions, it was felt to be a highly regressive form of public policy, benefiting a small elite. Basically, what was happening was that the coffee farmers, instead of doing kind of normal kind of planning and purchasing insurance or finding other ways of coping with the risks, were dumping their risks on the state, and the state was dipping into the pockets of the taxpayers in order to support this tiny, wealthy elite. And there was also a sort of deep affront to common sense, because in the 1920s, when they were faced with this enormous coffee mountain, the only thing the state could think of doing to get rid of it was to burn it. So there was a deep-seated revulsion in the public at the thought of all this food going to waste. So the coffee valorization scheme was deeply unpopular and to some extent with good reason. And this becomes an issue in the politics of the 1920s. And it's the politics of the 1920s which really mark the deepest phase of disillusionment with the Republic. I mentioned yesterday that the Republic was unpopular from the word go, because it was a military coup, and there was some people, perhaps not a large part of the population, perhaps 20%, who had an affection for the House of Braganza. But the big trouble was, of course, the new regime was often corrupt, and it was highly undemocratic, and politics was very often carried out in deals behind closed doors in dark, smoke-filled rooms, and the politics had a bad name. They tried to spread the blame around, so this is the great age of Brazilian regionalism. All the different states get their own constitutions, and some of them, of course, were very progressive. Rio Grande do Sul in the south was notable in wanting to have a constitution based entirely on the positive philosophy of Auguste Comte, and there are other examples of the disintegration of Brazil as a kind of coherent policy state. so there had been all these various kind of reasons for discontent, but it all kind of bubbles up and comes to a head in the 1920s. And the reason for this is, once again, the role of the military. From its foundation in 1889, the First Republic had been plagued with military conspiracies and officers' interventions in politics. But in the 1920s, things advanced to a new level with the movement known as tenentismo. This is from the Brazilian word for lieutenant. So this is the movement among the lieutenants, as opposed to the movement among the colonels. In the 19th century, as I explained the other day as well, because there was suspicion of people who were Portuguese new arrivals, the army had been supplemented by the creation of a national guard on a kind of regional basis, which was more or less like a militia. And this meant that in all the various Brazilian states, there tended to be local rule by military gentlemen who had the status of colonel. So this is coronelismo. And it's very much a rural thing, and what we get is, once again, the splitting of the armed forces. And this has been a constant pattern in Brazil's history. There's inter-service rivalry between the army and the navy, and then subsequently the air force. The navy has a particularly sort of extraordinary history, as I again mentioned the other day, and you see that right down to the present day. In fact, one of the most extraordinary things is that in addition to the Brazilian embassy in Washington, there's also an embassy of the Brazilian Navy, a quite separate building, and I think they're the only foreign navy who do have their own embassy. And then we have this division between the urban and rural people. We have the division between the professionals and the amateurs. So, in the 1920s, we get this movement known as tenentismo, and here, soldiers who were urban-based, middle-class professionals, usually captains and lieutenants, were protesting the corrupt rule of rural-based National Guard colonels, the system known as coronelismo. So it's an urban-rural split. It's also very often a split about ranks, because the top brass tended to side with the colonels, unfortunately, whereas the professional, ambitious young men who were in a hurry were, of course, in the lower ranks. And then there were other issues connected with conscription. So tenentismo was a movement of middle-class professional middle-rank officers together with forced conscripts. It was the forced conscripts, of course, who were the cannon fodder. And in the 1920s, it takes the form of really quite extraordinary interventions in the form of mutinies and kind of public attacks, the most famous of which was the rising of the Copocabana fort group on Copacabana Beach in 1922, which was an armed uprising where cannonballs were fired, including at the bathers. And here I have an amazing picture on the right of the aftermath with various people who've been arrested by the obedient part of the military being marched off to be court-martialed. Absolutely extraordinary kind of event. And there are further uprisings, and they're all unsuccessful, incidentally, but the movement just continues to grow. And we finally get a sort of parting of the ways with the emergence of two personalities who came to dominate politics in the 1930s. On the one hand, there was the military engineer Luis Carlos Prestes, who just missed the Copocabana uprising due to illness. He had to stay in bed that day, but it was fortunate for him, of course, because it meant he didn't get arrested. And the other person was the lawyer Getulio Vargas, who was eventually brought in to act as counsel for the accused soldiers and spokesman for the rebels, eventually. And the two of them are very different, but both very powerful personalities. And Prestes is the radical, or person who became increasingly radical. And Vargas, although he was the spokesman for the radicals, always kept his own counsel and was always a more measured and careful operator. He came from the south. He came from Rio Grande do Sul, and had one of these, kind of initially rather unspectacular legal careers. But in the 1920s, as the armed forces of Brazil disintegrated into factions, his role became increasingly prominent. And in the years 1925, 26, and 27, Prestes assumed leadership of the tenentismo movement, and there is this astonishing kind of epic where over those 3 years, Prestes led what was called the Prestes column, which was an astonishing march of dissident left-wing soldiers across 25,000 kilometers of the Brazilian backlands. It's been written up in a wonderful book by Neil, what's his name? I can't read it here. Neil Macaulay. And there's a map on the right of my slide there, showing you the movement of the Prestes column, how it started in the south, moved right up north to the northeast, then moved down again to Minas, then moved back up north again, and finally made the crossing of the Mato Grosso and landed up in Bolivia. An absolutely extraordinary kind of achievement. The Prestes Long March, if you talk to young left-wing Brazilians today, they will say this is something comparable to Chairman Mao's Long March. Of course, you just have to say that to realize it's nonsense, but this is mythology. This is imagery. This is stuff for young idealists. So there's the Prestes march, and it made Prestes into a national hero. He became untouchable, and a lot of people were out to get him. A lot of people were very hostile to this movement. And the whole aim of the march was perhaps not so much to create a revolution, unlike Chairman Mao. It was the idea of keeping the idea of revolution itself alive. So it was making propaganda for socialism among the poor peasants of Brazil, a group who were not being well served by conventional socialists because basically Brazil was not an industrial country. The industrialization such as had occurred at the end of the 19th century and before the First World War was relatively tiny. So if you followed the normal left-wing script of organizing trade unions of industrial workers, you were not going to get anywhere. And so this was Prestes' great idea about making propaganda and using the forces which were to hand, namely the dissatisfied professional soldiers and the unruly conscripts to kind of carry the argument for socialism right across Brazil. And I've got this wonderful picture of what the Prestes column looked like shortly after crossing into Bolivia. So there you see the survivors of this tremendous long march. I'm not sure it's all of them. There may well be stragglers. There may well be people in another picture. But you get some idea of what they looked like. A lot of them, of course, are very young. And one should say, of course, that a lot of them were not particularly left-wing. There's been a tendency to glamorize the Prestes story retrospectively and to see it as more left-wing than it actually was. And this was particularly true because after 1930, Prestes himself joined the Brazilian Communist Party. The Communist Party had been founded in 1922, but it had been very much a matter of a handful of enthusiasts, some of whom were German settlers and had read Karl Marx in the original, and it was very much a movement of organized workers in trade unions and a handful of intellectuals. So it didn't really amount to much in numerical terms, but after 1930, Prestes himself joined the Communist Party. And this, as I said, has lent a whole kind of left-wing credence to the movement, which perhaps it doesn't altogether deserve. The wonderful thing about Macaulay's book is he goes and interviews survivors, and you get some people there who were very definitely anti-communist. So, very interesting kind of historical movement. Now, the important thing is that in 1930, there is a mass movement all over Brazil among the soldiers, particularly the middle ranks, particularly the people who are conscripts, and the grassroots people are calling the shots. And so the grassroots members of the Tenentes put pressure on Prestes to go and have a meeting with Vargas, the canny lawyer from the south, who is providing the kind of official narrative, the official political interpretation which is associated with the movement. And the two of them get together in the town of Porto Alegre. Now, at that stage, Prestes was moving left, but Vargas was moving right. And Prestes at that stage had not yet joined the Communist Party, but he'd been reading all sorts of left-wing literature, and he had very definite ideas about how Brazil ought to be revolutionized. And in a passionate speech lasting 2 hours, he expounded his conception of revolutionary Brazilian socialism to Vargas, and evidently made a positive impression because Vargas there and then immediately decided to make Prestes a big donation. It has been estimated, it of course was in the currency of the time, which was the old Brazilian mil-réis, and it's been estimated that in modern terms it would be about $6 million. Enormous donation. And subsequently, as it became clear that Vargas was moving to become the public face of a bourgeois nationalist movement rather than a socialist movement, Prestes felt he was no longer bound by honor to observe the terms of the agreement and spend the money on the things which he said he would spend it on, so he donated the biggest part of it to the Comintern. and a part of it disappeared, and of course has become a subject of controversy among the Brazilian left ever since. There's a story about a big chunk being given to somebody who was killed in an air accident. You must understand also, of course, this is the period when Brazil is crazy about the aeroplane, Santos Dumont being the Brazilian pilot who went furthest. Now, Prestes joined the Brazilian Communist Party, and from 1934 actually became the Secretary General of the Brazilian Communist Party and held that office until his death. And he only died when he was 92, so it was a real kind of lifetime commitment. And of course, he had to preside over all the kind of things which were being handed out by the Comintern, which had a kind of grand plan for Latin America, just as it had a grand plan for Europe and a grand plan for North America. And very often these grand plans, of course, took no account of the reality on the ground. So he had a fairly tough life, I think, as a Stalinist. But it's always been an interesting question, much discussed on the Brazilian left, what would have happened if Prestes had not kind of joined the Communist Party, if he'd branched out somehow on his own. It does provide a kind of an opportunity for an alternative left history of Brazil. But what they actually got, of course, was an alternative right history of Brazil. Because Vargas was the most popular politician in Brazil in the 20th century, with the possible exception of Lula right at the end. But Lula really is a figure of the 21st century. Vargas had an absolutely extraordinary political career. He assumes power initially in 1930, and he serves no less than 4 terms as president. But they're not, not all of them consecutive, and they're all under rather different circumstances. But one thing is clear. From the beginning, in 1930, Vargas stood firm for Brazil in the world chaos of the time, which means the economic disruption resulting from the Wall Street crash and the various other economic disturbances of the 1930s. He pledged that Brazil was no longer going to be a dependent country. It would be independent of all these foreign powers. It would be an industrial country. It would be a modern country. And so these are absolute pledges made by Vargas from 1930 onwards. Now, when he comes to power in 1930, it's a 4-year term, and it's essentially done as a result of a negotiation between political parties in the Cortes, the Brazilian parliament. But the soldiers are standing in the wings, so this is a kind of thinly disguised coup. He's a civilian, leader of a coalition of parties where the real force comes from behind the scenes in the form of soldiers from the Tenentismo movement. And that's the first 4 years. He's frontman for a military coup manipulating a political coalition. In 1934, in the wake, of course, of further kind of agitations in the world economy and in world politics, one thinks of the rise of Hitler, one thinks of the general situation, the failure of the League of Nations in Europe, and of course one thinks also of the challenge coming from the communists. So by this stage, Prestes is Vargas's #1 critic. and they are going in completely opposite directions. Vargas is a bourgeois nationalist and an economic nationalist, whereas Prestes has become a communist. And there is danger of a communist coup, as you can imagine.